In this lesson, we are going to learn how to create a task which defines the containers I want to run. So I have my Contoso cluster. Let's learn how to create a task so that I define what containers and constraints that task has to follow when it runs on this cluster. To create a task, go to Task Definitions, then click the button Create New Task Definition. So you have two types of tasks you can create. One is Fargate, one is EC2. Fargate is the managed version, which we are not studying in this course. Because we want to go deep into how a container orchestration engine works, we are going to create EC2 based task definition. So select that and then click Next Step. Give it a name. You can give any name that you like. In this case, I'm going to name it as my batch app task. You can define a role. In this lesson, we are not going to define a role because there are certain ports that you need to be aware of. So the task role defines what permission the task assumes when that task is running. In Windows environments, you need to keep the network mode as default. Do not select any other network mode. Windows supports in this environment only NAT. So don't select any of these. Just leave the default as the network mode. If you select any of these different network modes designed for Linux containers, your containers may not start. Windows also don't support task level memory and CPU units, so leave them blank. But of course, you can allocate memory and CPU in container level, so which we'll learn very soon. To create a container, what you need to do is to go to container definitions and then add containers. You can of course add multiple containers. So I want to run one container called my batch app container. So let's give it a name. It can be any name that you like. And then I need to give the image location. So this can be Docker Hub repository location or maybe your private repository. But of course, in this case, we are going to point this one into Amazon ECR repository that we just created. So to find the URL of that repository, I'm going into AWS console and under Elastic Container Service, under repositories, we created this repository called my batch app. So here you can copy the URL and you can already find that there's a version called latest. So I'm going to paste this URL. Remember, the account name comes first, and the version I want to run is the latest version. So the version you can find here. If you have a different version, you can specify if you like. So once I define the image I want to run, I want to define the memory that I want to allocate. So you can define any number of memory. So in this case, I'm going to allocate 256. If you are running something like a website, you can define the port mapping. So this will be in another lesson. So this is a batch application. There's nothing port related in this container. You need to allocate enough CPU. So one vCPU is equivalent to 1024 CPU units. So if you want to give a fraction of the CPU into this container, you can define, let's say, something like 256. To give a quarter of vCPU. So in this case, I'm going to allocate a full CPU vCPU. So I'm going to specify 1024. The entry point and command we already learned in our previous section. So the command that I want to run when this container is running is this my batch app exe. We know inside the image we have a folder called my app, and inside that we have this my batch app exe. So that's what I want to run when this container is running. You can of course define a working directory, some environmental variables. So these environmental variables are going to appear like any other DOS environment or in your PowerShell environment as an environmental variable. So if you log into this EC2 instance, you can see them. So for the moment, I'm just going into define a sample key and some test 1, 2, 3 values for this environmental variable. You don't need to define that. This is just an example. You can of course define some DNS configurations. They are not usually necessary. And you can define the mount points to mount data volume. You can also define the login location, because when the containers stop and start, the output of those containers, you may lose them. So I'm going to define an AWS log group, and it asks me to fill some entries. So the first entry is that you need to define an AWS log group. So this is a CloudWatch log group name that you need to specify. To do that, go to CloudWatch. You can give an existing log group, or if you don't have a log group, you can create a log group. So if you go into CloudWatch and go under logs, you will find that you have an option to create a log group. So give it a name. So let's say I'm going to keep log groups based on the cluster. So I'm going to specify my Contoso log group. So create the log group. If you already have a log group, it will appear like this. If you want to create a new log group, you can create a one with a different UI. So for example, in this case, let's give it another name, my sample log group. So this is just an example, like if you already have the UI is a bit different. So I deleted this my sample log group, so I will just keep this one, my Contoso log group. So I copy this name, and that's the name I want to give. AWS region is the region of the log group. So as of now, I'm based in Sydney. So the Sydney region code, you can Google it. If you search AWS region endpoint and search for Sydney or any other region that you are executing these labs. So for the Sydney region, the code is app southeast 2. So I copy it and I'm going to paste it in the AWS log region. I can specify a prefix. So this cluster may run multiple containers or multiple tasks. To identify this one, I'm going to specify it as my batch app, some kind of a prefix that I can easily identify the logs created by this application. So in this case, I'm going to define something like my batch app. So the log group configuration is done. Of course, it's not a mandatory field. I'm just creating it to give an idea of what kind of properties you can define in task. There are multiple other things like Docker labels you can create. For the moment, we don't need it. Just click create. So we have defined one container with 256 memory and 1024 of CPU units. If you want, of course, you can add another container. For example, if you want to run another database behind the scene, you can do that. So I'm going to run only one batch application and then click create. So it created this task. You can find that the version it created in my case was version 11 because I have already created a previous version called version 10. So these versions are going to remain in your system unless you go there and then completely clear them up. If you want to deregister an existing version, you can do it with AWS CLI commands. There is one called deregister task definition. Using this one, you can deregister some unwanted versions in your environment. So as of now, I started with version 10, and once I changed this, it went to version 11. So in your environment, it may be you may start with version 1 and the new version would be version 2. So it depends on different environments. But it won't make a difference when you try to execute them on the cluster. So my task is ready. In the next section, we are going to learn how to run this batch app task in the cluster.